Don't let him see the will. Not yet, trust me on this one." She squeezed my hand once quickly, like she was afraid someone would notice. Then she walked away down the hospital corridor, and I stood there holding a paper cup of terrible coffee, wondering if grief was making me paranoid or if the woman who'd just warned me was the only honest person in the building. My name is Petra Calloway, and 3 days before my mother passed, I became the most valuable person in my husband's life. I just didn't know it yet. My mother had been sick for almost 2 years. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed late, treated aggressively, lost anyway. The kind of illness that reorganizes your entire life around it. I took a leave from my job at the architecture firm in Vancouver. I drove to Kelowna every second weekend. I sat with her through chemo while she made dark jokes about losing her hair. She was the funniest person I knew even at the end. She used to say that the only thing cancer couldn't take from her was her opinions, and she had a lot of those. My husband, whose name I will say once and then I'd prefer not to again, Kyle, had been supportive in the beginning, attentive even. He came to the hospital twice in the first 6 months. He organized a meal train with our neighbors. He told me he admired my strength, but strength is a lot more visible from a distance. And once my mother's illness stretched past the 1-year mark, past the point where it could still be called a crisis, and had become instead just the ongoing texture of our lives, his interest shifted. He was patient with me the way people are patient with a slow internet connection. Politely, barely. We'd been married just under 4 years. No children. A condo in East Vancouver that we'd bought together with a down payment he'd contributed more toward, a fact he mentioned with decreasing subtlety as the months went on. I'd been working part-time for most of the previous year, between the leave and the trips to Kelowna, which meant my paychecks were inconsistent, which meant the mortgage fell more heavily on him, which he let me feel every time we talked about money, which was often. I thought the financial stress was the source of the tension between us. I thought once my mother passed, once things settled, once I was back to full-time work, once I was present again in the way I hadn't been able to be, things would repair themselves. I was holding on to that belief like a railing on a steep staircase. The woman who stopped me in the hospital hallway was my mother's estate lawyer. Her name was Roberta Lom, and I had met her exactly once before. Briefly, at my mother's kitchen table 18 months earlier, when they had done the initial paperwork together. She was compact and precise, and had the kind of steady gaze that suggested she did not say things she didn't mean. She told me to come find her before I signed anything. She told me my mother had updated her will 6 weeks prior. She told me there were protections in place I didn't know about yet, and that I should let her walk me through them before I mentioned the estate to anyone. Anyone, not the word she used, but the emphasis was there. I thought about Kyle waiting downstairs in the car. He'd driven up with me from Vancouver that morning, the first time he'd made the trip in months, attentive again suddenly, refilling my water bottle and putting his hand on my back in that way that used to feel like comfort, and now felt like inventory. I thought about how his first question after my mother's palliative nurse called was not, "How are you?" but "What did she leave?" He didn't phrase it that way. He said, "Practical things to think about." He said, "We should probably understand what the estate situation looks like." He said it with his eyes a little too steady, the way he looked when he was trying to appear casual about something he'd been thinking about for a long time. My mother died on a Tuesday in October. It rained the way it rains in the interior in the fall, gray and flat and total. I held her hand. Kyle stood near the door. The will reading happened 8 days later. Kyle came. He sat beside me with his hand on my knee the whole time, and I remember thinking his hand felt heavy. Roberta Lamb read through everything carefully. My mother's house in Kelowna, paid off, appraised at just over $900,000. Investments and savings totaling another $420,000. Some jewelry, some furniture, a 2019 Subaru, and a lake lot outside of Penticton that my grandfather had bought in the 70s and which had been quietly appreciating for 50 years. All of it left to me. Kyle's hand on my knee tightened just slightly, not hard, just noticeably. There was one more item. Roberta explained it with the same steady voice she used for everything else. A specific clause, added at my mother's request 6 weeks before her death. The inheritance was to be structured as a separate property trust under my name alone, not subject to family property division, not accessible to or claimable by a spouse. Protected under a Section 85 designation with a trustee review requirement before any transfer or sale. My mother, it turned out, had opinions about Kyle too. Roberta looked at me while she explained this. Not at Kyle. At me. The same look she'd given me in the hallway. Kyle's hand left my knee. On the drive back to Vancouver, he was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that isn't peace, it's pressure. The Okanagan connector stretched out ahead of us, dark past Merritt, the mountains invisible in the rain. I watched the road and waited. Your mom really didn't trust me, he said finally. His voice was neutral. Careful. She was protecting her assets, I said. That's what the clause is for. It's insulting. He said it like it was a small thing. Like he was only slightly bothered. But his jaw was tight, and I had 3 hours of highway left with him, and something had shifted in the air of the car that I couldn't name. It's her estate, I said. It was her decision. He didn't say anything else for 40 minutes. When we got home, he poured himself a drink and sat at the kitchen island with his laptop open, and I went to take a shower, and I stood under the hot water until it ran cold, and I thought about that hand on my knee and the way it had tightened. I thought about Roberta saying don't let him see the will not yet, which meant she had reason to think seeing it first would change something. I thought about the 6 weeks between my mother updating her will and her death and what she might have seen or heard or understood in those weeks that I had been too close to see clearly. I got out of the shower and sat on the edge of the bed, and I opened my phone and I texted my best friend Hazel and stopped. Hazel was also Kyle's cousin. Not close, but close enough that things got complicated. I texted Roberta instead. She responded within 10 minutes. She had been expecting to hear from me. We met at her office in Kelowna the following week, just the two of us. She told me that 6 weeks before her death, my mother had called her with a specific concern. She'd overheard a phone call. Kyle, in the backyard of my mother's house when he thought no one was listening, talking about property transfer timelines and joint asset consolidation and something that my mother described as a plan. Not a conversation, a plan. She hadn't been able to hear the full call. She didn't know who he was talking to. But she heard enough to recognize the shape of it, the way you recognize the shape of weather before it arrives. She hadn't told me. She said she'd almost told me a dozen times, and every time she stopped herself, because she wasn't completely certain, and because she knew that grief and uncertainty together are a particular kind of unbearable. So she did the one thing she was certain she could do. She called her lawyer. Roberta told me what the trust structure meant in practical terms. The Kelowna house could not be sold without my signature and the trustee review. The investments could not be transferred without documentation and a 60-day notice period. The lake lot was registered under the trust entirely and could not be touched without a court application. My mother had built a wall around everything she had, and she had built it quietly, and she had built it in the 6 weeks she had left, and she had not told me because she didn't want to be wrong, and she didn't want to hurt me, and she ran out of time. I drove back to Vancouver, and I did not tell Kyle any of this. He had shifted by then into a different kind of attentive. Soft and deliberate. He brought me coffee in the mornings and sat close to me on the couch and mentioned once, carefully, that a financial advisor he knew had some good ideas about inheritance tax minimization, that it might be worth a conversation. He mentioned that consolidating assets could simplify things, administratively. He mentioned that it would make sense, given how much of the mortgage he'd been covering, to think about how to rebalance things between us. Each time I said, "You're probably right, let me think about it." Each time I watched his shoulders loosen by a fraction. I went back to full-time work. I started meeting with Roberta regularly, by phone, usually during my lunch break from a bench near the office where I could speak freely. I started paying attention the way I hadn't let myself pay attention before. I went back through our joint accounts and looked at the deposits and withdrawals over the previous 18 months. Nothing obviously wrong, but a pattern. Small transfers to an account I didn't recognize, amounts under $1,000 each, irregular enough not to trigger alerts, consistent enough to add up. I printed the records and sent them to a forensic accountant Roberta recommended. Her name was Dr. Chen, and she was thorough in a way that was quietly frightening. Dr. Chen came back to me 3 weeks later with a summary. The account the transfers led to was not Kyle's primary account. It was a holding account registered to a numbered company incorporated in Alberta. The company had one other director, a woman named Francesca Bale. I did not know Francesca Bale. I found her in 20 minutes on LinkedIn, corporate paralegal, specializing in estate and property transfers. Kyle had followed her on Instagram for at least 2 years. She had a post from the previous August, a photo of Whistler, a sunset, someone's arm around her shoulder cropped out of frame. The arm was wearing the watch I'd given Kyle for his birthday 2 years ago. I sat in my parked car outside our condo building, and I held my phone, and I felt the cold of it with complete and unusual clarity. Not the specific cold of heartbreak, though that was there too somewhere, but the colder cold of understanding. The thing you feel when something that was confusing suddenly makes sense, when all the distances and silences and small resentments resolve into a single coherent shape. He wasn't waiting for me to grieve and recover. He was waiting for me to sign. I went upstairs and made dinner and poured wine and listened to him talk about his week, and I said almost nothing, and I think he read it as grief and thought he was being patient with me, and the whole time I was deciding exactly what I was going to do next. I did not want the dramatic confrontation. I did not want the screaming in the kitchen. I wanted documentation, legal protection, and distance in that order. I called Roberta the following morning. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'm glad your mother did what she did." I said, "So am I." We spent the next 3 weeks building a case before I said a single word to Kyle. Dr. Chen documented the financial trail thoroughly. The transfers, the numbered company, Francesca's directorship, records of estate-adjacent transactions that coincided with the deaths or marriages of women in Kyle's past. He had done this before. Not to this extent, not with this level of legal preparation on the other side, but a version of this, a pattern. 2 previous relationships where finances had been restructured around critical moments. Both women had been too embarrassed or uncertain to pursue anything afterward. I was not going to be too embarrassed. The morning I ended it, Kyle thought we were going to meet with his financial advisor. I had told him the previous evening over dinner that I was ready to talk seriously about the estate, that Roberta had outlined a few options that might work for both of us, that I thought he was right, we should simplify things. He looked at me over his wine glass with something in his eyes that I recognized in retrospect as relief, the particular relief of someone who thinks the hardest part is behind them. He dressed carefully that morning. He was in a good mood. The address I gave him was a law office in downtown Vancouver. Not Roberta's Kelowna firm, but an associated firm she used for litigation. He walked in expecting a financial planning meeting. Roberta was there, along with the forensic accountant's full report, printed and tabbed and waiting on the conference table. Kyle looked at the table. He looked at Roberta. He looked at me. "This isn't what I thought this was," he said. "No," I said. I watched him do the calculation. His face stayed controlled for about 30 seconds, and then something moved underneath it. Not guilt. Something more calculated than guilt. He looked at Roberta and said there must be some misunderstanding about the transfers, that the numbered company was a perfectly legitimate structure, that any appearance of impropriety was a misreading of the documents. Roberta let him finish. Then she turned to the third tab of the report. The 60-day notice period on my mother's investment trust had been triggered 6 days after her death. Not by me. By a transfer request submitted by a cosigner. Kyle had gotten to one document, one. Before the trust protections caught it, Roberta placed the attempted transfer paperwork on the table. He'd already started. He hadn't waited. He hadn't even waited to pretend to grieve. The room was very quiet. Outside Vancouver was gray and busy and indifferent. "You tried to move protected trust assets without my knowledge," Roberta said. "Under BC's Estate Administration Act, that constitutes an unauthorized dealing with estate property. Combined with the pattern of conduct your forensic accountant has documented, we are looking at potential civil and criminal exposure." Kyle looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time in that room, maybe the first time in months. I don't know what he expected to see. Whatever it was, he didn't find it. "What do you want?" he said quietly. Roberta slid the separation agreement across the table. Clean. Pre-negotiated. His name off the condo title in exchange for a fair assessment of his contributed equity. The joint accounts divided equitably. The estate trust untouched. No criminal charges provided the agreement was signed and the Francesca Bale account dissolved within 30 days. Refuse, and Roberta had already been in contact with the Law Society and with two of the other women from his past who had agreed to speak. He signed. The pen made a small sound against the paper. He didn't say anything on the way out. No parting speech, no last attempt at reframing. He walked through the lobby and out the glass doors, and I watched him go from the window on the second floor, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not quite sadness and not quite satisfaction, but something more like clarity, like standing outside after a long time indoors. There's a detail I kept back. Roberta told me later when it would matter less to tell me all at once. The woman who warned me in the hospital hallway, who squeezed my hand and told me not to let him see the will, had not acted on her own professional judgment alone. My mother had left her a letter, to be opened if anyone came to her after the will reading with questions or concerns. The letter asked Roberta if she had any doubt to find me before I left the building that day, to say exactly what she said. My mother wrote it 2 weeks before she died. She wrote it knowing she might not be wrong and knowing she might not have time to tell me directly, and knowing that the one thing she could still do was make sure someone was standing in the right hallway at the right moment. I go to Kelowna 4 or 5 times a year now. I stay in her house, which is mine, which still smells like her candles and her particular brand of tea. I sit on the back deck in the evenings and look at the hills, and I talk to her sometimes, quietly, the way you talk to people after they're gone. I used to think the best thing she ever gave me was her stubbornness. Turns out it was her foresight, and she gave it to me right on time. I think about my mother a lot when I'm sitting on that back deck in Kelowna. Not always with grief anymore. More often with something that feels like gratitude, which is a strange thing to feel about a person who's gone. But she made a decision in the last weeks of her life that required her to be clear-eyed about something painful, and she made it anyway, quietly, without telling me, because she knew I wasn't ready to hear it. That took more than love. That took a kind of moral clarity that I didn't fully understand until I was sitting in a law office watching my husband realize the plan had already been dismantled before he even started. Kyle was not an impulsive person. That's the part I keep turning over. He was patient and methodical, and he had done this before in smaller ways, with other women who had less protection around them. What stopped him wasn't bad luck. It was that my mother thought harder than he did, earlier than he did, and she was willing to act on what she knew even when she couldn't be completely certain. She didn't have the luxury of waiting until she was sure. So she did what she could do with the time she had. There's something in that I'm still learning from. I spent a long time after everything settled asking myself how I missed it. The honest answer is that I wasn't looking. Not because I was naive exactly, but because I had decided, somewhere without fully deciding, that watching my husband too carefully would mean I didn't trust him, and not trusting him would mean the marriage was already broken, and I wasn't ready for it to be broken. So I kept my eyes slightly unfocused, the way you do when you're afraid of what sharpness might show you. What I understand now is that paying attention is not the same as suspicion. It's not a failure of love to ask questions about money, to understand what you're signing, to know where your assets are and what protections exist around them. My mother knew that. Roberta knew that. I had to learn it the way most people learn the things that matter, which is through the experience of not knowing it first. What carried me through the months between my mother's death and that morning in the law office was not bravery in any grand sense. It was smaller than that. It was making one careful decision at a time, staying methodical when I wanted to be reactive, trusting the people who had shown me they were trustworthy, and refusing to let grief make me careless with the things my mother had worked to protect. That steadiness, that refusal to fall apart before the work was finished, was something I had to build in real time. I didn't know I had it until I needed it. The consequences for Kyle and Francesca weren't something I orchestrated beyond the legal process. What happened to his career, to her practice, followed naturally from what they had done. Actions have weight. They accumulate. The plan that looked clean from the inside had a paper trail that led exactly where it led, and no amount of careful framing could change that once someone with the right credentials started looking. I used to think the most important thing my mother gave me was her stubbornness. I still think that's part of it, but the other part, the part I'm most grateful for, is that she showed me what it looks like to act with integrity when it's inconvenient, when you're tired, when you might be wrong, when you're running out of time. She did the right thing quietly and completely and left me the evidence of it. That's the inheritance I actually live off of.